Welcome. Today we're looking at the Strata Advancetig400. The first thing we're going to do is go into our settings. Here we can see we have high frequency TIG, lift TIG, arc mode, settings, and smart TIG. If I go into settings, push the center button, the first thing I'm going to do is turn the beeper off because it doesn't do it for me. Here we go, turn that off. Another thing we can look at here, if we go into the right hand side by pushing the button on the right, we can switch it from gas to water cooled. So if you have a water cooled TIG, obviously we want to have this on. Let's push the center button, turns the water cooler on. For the purpose of this video, I haven't got a torch hooked up, so I'm just going to leave it on gas cooled. The fan mode, so smart essentially means that it's running on a thermostat, so it's only going to turn on when it's needed. Normal will leave the fan running the whole time. Here we can select and calibrate or connect our wireless foot control, and again we can turn it from remote to wireless in this section. So if I go into smart TIG, let's have a look at this. So I've talked to a few people that have this machine, and some of them say this is the easiest way to use it. So instead of setting up all your post-gas and pre-gas and all those functions, we can simply select alloy, butt joint, fillet joint, whatever we're doing, the diameter of the plate thickness, and we're sorted. So this has pre-selected our amps, and yes, if it's a little bit too hot or too cold, you can change it on your dial, on your hand control, or on your foot control. But that's a pretty basic way to set it up. We can still come into the background here and do fine adjustment on the settings if we want to. Now if I come back to high frequency TIG, using the center button we can scroll through some of the options. So currently we're on amps. Push it again, it's asking us whether we want the pulse on or off. I'll leave that on for now. 2T or 4T. So this is our trigger mode. So again, for those who haven't used 4T before, we push the trigger, it starts the weld. The weld stays current until you push the trigger and release it again. 2T is probably what most people would be used to, or basic normal welding. Push the trigger to start, let it go to stop. Go back through that. So if we start with the amps, which is our light flashing down the bottom here, we can adjust our amps up and down. Again, we can do that on our foot control if you're using a foot control, or on your torch. From there we have pulse, whether you want that on or off. We'll leave it on at the moment just to show you the settings. 2T or 4T. Again, 2T's on and off. 2T and 4T. 2T is essentially push the trigger, let it will start welding, release the trigger, it will stop. 4T, push the trigger, release it, keeps welding until you push the trigger and release it again to stop. That would be used in applications where you're doing long welds and you don't want to keep your finger on the button all the time. Here we have our waveform. So DC is essentially for mild steel and stainless. That is the only waveform you'll generally use on mild steel and stainless. The rest of our waveforms here are for aluminium, square wave, sine wave, triangle, and all sorts of crazy variations of the two for different cleaning and penetration, I guess, or different applications depending on how dirty or the depth required on your weld. Many people will just use one of the first three, but it's one of those situations where go and try it and see if you like the other ones. So we select that. From there we can come over and push our right hand button that brings up our other settings. So at the start here, the neat thing is it tells us which each of these are. So pre-flow, how much gas is coming out before the arc is going to be initiated. If you have a situation where you're sitting there and you're thinking this machine will not start, I'm waiting and I'm waiting for it to start, often your pre-gas is too high. You need some pre-gas when doing TIG welding, because if you have this switched off and your arc starts before your tungsten is fully covered with argon, you may contaminate your tungsten. The next one we have here is your starting amps. It doesn't go below 10 amps. There's a reason for that. If it went down to 5 amps or 2 amps or whatever, often that's not enough to actually initiate the current, and once again your arc will start or it won't start properly. So they've set the base amp as a minimum of 10. The next one we have here is your upslope or your ramp up. So this is how long it takes to get from 10 amps to 100 amps where we've got our peak current. So pretty much we're saying here it's going to be instant. So you might want to have it at maybe, I don't know, half a second, whatever. So it takes a little while for it to climb up to that peak amp. Righto, so now let's have a look. We've got our main amp range here and our secondary amp range here. So when we're using the pulse function, it's bouncing between the hotter amps and the lower amps. So it's heating or expanding your weld pool and then letting it cool again and then heating it again. We can adjust both, and we can adjust the duty. Now, my understanding is the duty is choosing between how much time we're going to spend on the hot cycle and how much time we're going to spend on the cooler cycle. So we might want to bias on the hot but just cool for a short amount of time, or vice versa. The next function is frequency. So we can choose how many times a second this is going to happen. We can have it running really fast, jumping backwards and forwards between the two amp ranges, or we can have it running slow depending on the material and the type of weld you're doing. We have our downslope. So again, we've been at either pulse or at our peak amp ratio, how long it takes to get back down to our base rate once we've released our finger off the trigger. And at the end we have post flow. Post flow can be very different for different users. Some people have it set at 5 or 6 seconds. Other people might only have it at 1.5 to 2 seconds. Once again, it's about letting your weld cool and not contaminating your tungsten. So now we've gone through our basics here. If you want to go into the background and have a bit more of a complicated play, we can hit this right hand button again. The first one that comes up is balance. Now essentially we can go in by pushing our button and we can plus or minus our balance. If you have a read up on this, essentially one way will give it more cleaning on your weld, so it will go out wider and clean your edge of your weld. The other way will give you more penetration and more heat into the weld. AC frequency, this is an interesting one. Some TIGs don't have it, some of them are preset. Lots of debate on where your frequencies should be set, but a colleague of mine who's done a lot of TIG welding said he's always just put it on 100 and it's always worked fantastic. Had a call from a customer the other day that said their TIG was stuttering, that wouldn't hold a decent arc, and it turns out they'd gone in and they'd turned their frequency down to 60. They turned it up to 100 and it took off and it welded beautifully. Diameter, so again, if you want a smart result and you want your machine to assist you in presetting some of your parameters and helping you do a tidy job, one of the key things you can do is come in here and select your tungsten diameter. So obviously if you change your diameter, it's going to change the characteristics of your weld. So you'll need to come back in and change that again if you go to a smaller or larger tungsten. So this function here, I had to have a bit of a read on this because I hadn't seen it before. I'm not going to tell you I know everything about it, but from what I understand, this is primarily for when you're not introducing a filler rod. So if you're remelting the base material, and there's a bit of a technique to that, you can increase or decrease this and it will change the welding characteristics. Next function, cap shaping, essentially helps assist with creating a ball on the end of your tungsten for when you're doing aluminium. To get back out onto our main screen, hit the button there and we're good to go. Or if we need to get back into the menu, we push the left hand button here. Otherwise, that's about it.